Hello, everyone. This is Craig Brailsford. I'm from Red Chip Companies. Thank you for joining today's event with OS Therapies, which trades on the New York Stock Exchange American under the ticker OSTX. With us today, we have Paul Romness, Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of OS Therapies, and Gerald Commission, the Chief Business Officer. We will begin with a brief presentation in a moment, and then OS Therapies will answer your questions. Users may submit a question at any time. Click the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window. Before we begin, please allow me to read the safe harbor statement. This call may contain forward-looking statements within the meaning of the Private Securities Litigation Reform Act of 1995. All statements pertaining to future financial and/or operating results, along with other statements about the future expectations, beliefs, goals, plans, or prospects expressed by management, constitute forward-looking statements. Any statements that are not historical facts should also be considered forward-looking statements. Of course, forward-looking statements involve risks and uncertainties. I now turn the webinar over to the OS Therapies team. Gentlemen, please go ahead.
Thank you, Craig. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you all. My name is Gerald Commission. I'm Chief Business Officer at OS Therapies, and Paul Romness, our CEO, is here. I'm going to walk through the corporate presentation, highlighting some of the key aspects of what we're doing here at OS, and then Paul and I will be available for questions. So a little bit about the company. OS Therapies was really founded around the mission of identifying and bringing to market a new treatment for osteosarcoma. When Paul started the company, he was able to identify a number of treatments that KOLs, key opinion leaders, thought would be potentially useful in the area of osteosarcoma. And it turns out that a Listeria-targeted immunotherapy was at the top of the list. And so the company was founded around this Listeria-targeted OST-HER2, which is a bacterial Listeria attenuated vector engineered to infect HER2 overexpressing cells, typically found in cancers. And the idea was that if you gave this immunotherapy, the immunotherapy would infect the cancer cells. The cancer cells would then, as a result of the Listeria, generate an immune response, and that immune response would be robust with multiple avenues of immune activation targeting those HER2 overexpressing cancer cells, leading to death. The primary focus in osteosarcoma is not around the original tumor, because the original tumor is treated by resection, which is effectively cutting out the tumor, as you do with most tumors, but really around preventing the metastasis from that tumor. So, for example, when you're cutting out a bone, you can pretty much get the whole piece of the bone that you want to go after. You know, if you're cutting out a brain cancer or a breast cancer or cancer from another part of the body, it's not always so simple. And so the big issue with osteosarcoma as compared with other cancers is not necessarily just keeping the original cancer at bay because you can cut it out, but really preventing metastasis. And metastasis, so having the bone cancer move to another part of the body, happens in about 50% of cases after the original tumor was resected, and it primarily happens and goes to the lung. And so that's what we're trying to do here with OST-HER2, is to prevent metastases to the lung. So a little bit about osteosarcoma. It's an ultra-orphan indication. There are actually about 1,000 new diagnoses per year. The primary treatment is resection and chemotherapy. So you get diagnosed with osteosarcoma. Typically, you go to the doctor, you think you have a pain, a strain, or a bone bruise, or something more orthopedic in nature, and they see through the scans that it is actually cancerous. And then you, at some point shortly thereafter, begin chemotherapy treatment for 2 months. They then take the piece of bone out that has the cancer in it out. They put some kind of hardware in to facilitate proper use of the limb. As a result of that, you continue to receive chemotherapy for another 7 months for a total of 9 months of treatment. And then you hope that the cancer doesn't come back. That's effectively the standard of care. 50% of the time it does come back. And if it comes back, the primary treatment is to cut out the cancer, usually in the lung. The problem is that with osteosarcoma, if you get one metastasis to the lung, you typically continue to get them. And it's an extremely fatal cancer with an over 90% 5-year death rate. So the trial and the endpoint that the FDA recommended was to see if we could prevent in the 50% of the patients that we know will recur. So we only enrolled patients that we knew were going to have ongoing metastases, if we could prevent that recurrence. So that's just to set the stage for everything that's going on. That's what the whole company is built around. But it's important to note that this OST-HER2 Listeria vector is not just good potentially for osteosarcoma. There are several other applications, including breast cancer, as well as all other solid tumors with regards to preventing metastases, because the mechanism from which you have a solid tumor, some of the cells peel off that tumor, circulate around the body, find soft tissue and oxygen, which is primarily in the lungs, and then grow, is not limited to osteosarcoma. That happens in almost every solid tumor. And so the mechanism through which this OST-HER2 works could be applicable to multiple cancers in a market, total addressable market of over $250 billion. The other technology that the company has beyond Listeria in general, because we have more than one vector as part of our pipeline at this point, is antibody drug conjugates. We have a platform. We're able to create, mix and match different targeting antibodies and therapeutic payloads of antibody drug conjugates. Antibody drug conjugates over the last several years have been a very important area in biotech and pharmaceuticals, because the idea is that they're basically targeted chemotherapy and ways of combining chemotherapy in a targeted way with less side effects with other immunotherapies like antibodies, so that you can create combo treatments that have better effect on cancer. And the shift from getting drugs everywhere in the body, where you have a lot of side effects, to more targeted treatment is really a sea change in the biotech space that at least the CEO of Abbott thinks is going to kind of replace the chemotherapy market overall, which is a multi-hundred-billion-dollar market. So a little bit about the company and just some background. With regards to the lead platform, over $250 million was invested in the platform, primarily by a predecessor company by the name of Advaxis. And I say predecessor not from a corporate entity standpoint, but that's who we licensed the technology from originally, and have since entered into an agreement to acquire all the assets related to Listeria from that company. So that significant investment led to both preclinical data, clinical data, manufacturing data, toxicity data, where we really have a really good handle on the tech, and it, from a regulatory perspective, is commercial ready. So now the question is just which indication is it going to be commercialized first? And as I mentioned, the one we're taking it forward in is osteosarcoma, and we'll talk about the results from that trial. So we have multiple near-term catalysts. We're actually contemplating about whether it's going to be a type B or a type C meeting with FDA. So it's a slight shift there, but expecting to have a meeting with the FDA in the near term and subsequent BLA submissions. We're currently in the process of preparing to really substantively engage FDA on some key questions as we tailor and prepare our data for submission. We have what we believe is a pretty straightforward path towards full approval for OST-HER2 in canines. We'll give some updates there, as well as FDA full approval, which we're hoping to get by the end of this year. So, those are pretty significant regulatory and then commercial milestones coming up within the next 12 months. The markets that we're going after, initially, the market for osteosarcoma in humans is about 1.2 billion. We think that we can generate top line revenue of about 500 million with this therapy if it hits the market. So we would both, capture significant market share while also growing the market, and that's a result of bringing the first new therapy in osteosarcoma to market over the last 40 years. The canine osteosarcoma market, we think, is $150 million plus market. And while the cost of a treatment in canine osteosarcoma will be less than in human, there are many, many, many more canines that get osteosarcoma than humans. So there are about 1,000 humans a year in the US that get osteosarcoma, 20,000 globally. There are about 40 to 50,000 dogs in the US that get osteosarcoma, and well over 1 million worldwide. And so we think, the market, while the margins will be less in canine, there are many, many more patients. And one of the big things and one of the reasons why the investment thesis behind OS Therapies is intact is because of a special program that the FDA put together called the Priority Review Voucher Program to encourage companies to develop drugs for rare pediatric diseases. The scheme put in place by the FDA was basically to incentivize companies, if they were to actually find a treatment for a rare pediatric condition, that we would be eligible to not only have an expedited review of the treatment that we're bringing to market. If that treatment gets approved, you would then get another voucher to use as priority review, which is essentially a fast pass through the FDA. It cuts about 4 months off your review process. So we have rare pediatric disease designation, and by virtue of having received that in 2021, despite the fact that the program is sunsetting in 2026, we've been grandfathered in, and if we get approval by September 30th, 2026, we will be granted a priority review voucher. The last priority review voucher sold for $150 million, and we expect that the value of that voucher will stay or in that range or move higher. We also have orphan drug designation and fast track designation, which allows us to have less formal interactions with the FDA, which is something that we're in the process of doing now as we prepare for that Type B and Type C meeting. Before I move on from here, Paul, do you want to say anything about the PRV program from a regulatory perspective, as I know you had a lot of work in that area?
No, it's just a program that works, right? It encouraged companies like ours to do research in rare and pediatric diseases. And if we do, then we can sell this voucher to Big Pharma, and they can cut in line at the FDA by 4 months. It's a program that costs the government no money, and it funds companies like ours, and it gets new therapies to the market for rare and pediatric diseases. It's kind of a no-brainer to me for getting reauthorized, which I think it will be in the near future.
Yeah, and so just to that point, when we say it creates the investment thesis, if we get approved and we sell the voucher, we get this $150 million. That's the ROI right there. You don't actually have to have a commercial success in order to get the ROI for the investment. And that's one of the reasons why, our investors, that both pre-IPO and IPO investors, really like the program, because it's an immediate return. You don't have to wait for a commercial success, which sometimes in these indications can take some time to really achieve.
I think a good example out of that is Day One Bio, DAWN, and they got approval for their drug in November 11th, and on November 14th, they sold their priority review voucher for $105 million. Now, it's a little lower than the last one that sold, but non-dilutive funds into a small company like ours, this is a significant thing, and it could fund a lot of research. It could fund the commercialization of our products. So it's a great opportunity for us.
Yep. So a little bit about a snapshot of the company. I think today our stock price was a little lower. We'll talk a little bit about that towards the end, some of the market mechanics as to why we think, at least, the prices come in. But there are about 22 million shares outstanding. Our market cap is somewhere in the $30 to $40 million range. I think the most important thing for investors to understand is that we have sufficient cash on hand to get into mid-2026. So to get through the data extension portion that we're completing now for FDA, as well as through the meetings, the submission, and the approval process that we're moving forward with. Our cash burn is anywhere between $300,000 to $400,000 a month. It's going down now as all the expenses associated with the trial kind of trail off, and we've got a limited exposure in terms of what we're spending, both on the manufacturing and the regulatory side to get the product approved. Again, because the $250 million got the product into a commercial ready position from a manufacturing standpoint. So we're in a very strong position there. We think we're within the 12-month window for conditional or accelerated approval with FDA and a priority review voucher. And at the end of that, as we just discussed, there's the prize of this PRV sale. So just a note, the company, if you follow the company at the time of the IPO, back then we only had a license to the OST-HER2 vector from Ayala, which is essentially Advaxis, which is a company that originally developed this technology. At one point had $1 billion market cap. Since that time, in late January, we entered into an agreement to acquire all the other assets, which includes a phase 2 lung cancer asset with some interesting data, a phase 1 prostate cancer asset, as well as all the other preclinical assets the company had, and ownership of the underlying IP to our OST-HER2 vector that we've developed for osteosarcoma and has potential in breast cancer and other HER2 cancer indications. And the real value here is there was a approval milestone, an FDA submission / approval milestone of $3.5 million that came off the table. So, effectively, this financed the company and extended the runway, so we won't have to spend that money. In addition, there are a bunch of sales milestones and royalties. Royalty about another $16.5 million in the first $100 million in sales, as well as 10% royalty that have come off. So now our royalty rate is only 1.5%. And while that's
to the University of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, to the University of Pennsylvania. And while that's typically something that people don't focus on now, for us that's important because as we consolidate all the intellectual property and we start moving forward and getting feedback from FDA, and obviously as that happens, hopefully the probability of actually getting the approval goes up in the eyes of the market and potential partners. The significant reduction in the royalty rate really opens up the opportunities for partnerships for us, where there's a lot more flexibility without having to pay a 10% royalty rate. So we felt like this was a great transaction for us and really opens up the potential for a number of different ways in which we can bring the therapy to market. So a little bit about the pipeline. As I mentioned, osteosarcoma is the lead. We finished all treatment associated with the phase 2b trial. We think we have enough data to get it through the FDA and get to a conditional or accelerated approval. We're working through some of the additional non-clinical data that or non-treatment related data that the FDA would likely need to get the approval, and we're having conversations with the FDA around that. So that's the main focus. But it's important to note, we now have a more significant pipeline in the Listeria. We have a completely separate vector. We're calling it OST-503. It was previously called ADXS-503, and that's in non-small cell lung cancer. It helps improve sensitivity to Keytruda after failure, which is obviously very significant. We also have frontline as standalone as in combination in non-small cell lung cancer. Obviously, we have our HER2 vector, which has completed a phase 1 and potentially can move into a phase 2 in breast cancer or a breast cancer plus other HER2 targeted cancers, as well as a completely separate vector that we're calling OST-504, known as ADXS-504 currently, that is in recurrent prostate cancer. And then separately from those human indications, as mentioned, the OST-HER2 vector has received conditional approval from the USDA. We're completing the transitioning from the prior group that had it and working through the process of making it available to patients or to canine patients in the US, and then the plan for full approval. And that's had to take somewhat of a backseat because we've had to focus our resources, obviously, on the human osteosarcoma. But now that we have a high degree of confidence where that's going, and we got a little bit more money than we expected in our second financing, we're evaluating ways to take that forward with UPenn so that patients can get access sooner rather than later. This is this second kind of therapy class, this antibody drug conjugate or drug conjugate, tunable drug conjugates that we're developing. They're all preclinical at this point. And what we've decided to do to leverage this is to put this asset class into a subsidiary and then leverage our position as a public company to be able to attract partners with clinical stage assets, but maybe not significant access to the US market for their drugs, and see if we can find the right combinations of assets to create standalone public companies that we could then reward shareholders with dividends. And we'll talk about that a little later. It's not kind of the main focus of what we're doing as a company, but in terms of creating near-term value for shareholders, it's something that we've put a spotlight on. So just a little bit about OST-HER2. It's originally developed for breast cancer, and that's obviously one of the reasons why we have a high degree of confidence that if it gets on the market for osteosarcoma, there is significant potential for label expansion. It's an off-the-shelf immunotherapy platform invented by Dr. Yvonne Patterson, lead veterinarian Nicola Mason, who is the one who's taking it through and has done some important clinical work for the product. We kind of shied away from calling it a vaccine because it's in cancer settings. People have confused the term vaccine with immunotherapy in the past. Although this week we did see some interesting results in pancreatic cancer with another immunotherapy treatment that was looked at as vaccination. So I think that this whole field of cancer immunotherapy with these types of vectors is really taking off. And I think we're going to be the beneficiary of understanding how to use these better now. A little bit about the data that we generated in canines. As you can see, we more than doubled historical control group survival at the 2-year time point with the OST-HER2 treated group as compared to with the historical control. We think that this mechanism is very consistent with the data that's been generated both in canines and in humans. This is what gave the initial promise that this would work in humans. Obviously, with the trial that we've completed, we think that this happens to be the case. And some interesting findings from some work that they've been doing at UPenn that we recently got access to in terms of data could help us drive our strategy as we move towards the FDA in light of some publications that are going to be coming out here in the very near term on the canine data. So what's very clear is that human osteosarcoma has a 96% homology with canine osteosarcoma, and the data generated using this approach is very translatable. And we think that the data and the information generated in the canine can help us make even better use than we've already made of our OST-HER2 vector, which is very exciting because as we move forward and we bring this technology forward, there are a lot of potential ways in which we can help improve treatment outcomes for patients. In terms of the mechanism, as I mentioned, the idea is you give this vector, it infects the cancer cells, both in the solid tumors as well as the micrometastases that are floating around in the blood. And by infecting those and activating the immune system against them, you activate killer T cells, NK cells, dendritic cells, and really create a really strong immune response. As everyone knows, The Listeria is something the body reacts very violently towards, which is very important. Now, that violent reaction is actually a challenge for Advaxis. And one of the reasons why they couldn't bring it to market was they didn't spend a lot of time really understanding that immune response. And I think the COVID years kind of taught everybody, hey, when you take something, it's really important to monitor and understand the immune response so that you can deal with side effects. In the case of, unlike the virus, in which you take antivirals, which sometimes are not great. For bacteria, we have very good antibacterials. We have antibiotics. And what we identified, our chief scientist identified, which was an extension of the work he did at Advaxis, he did it, here at OS Therapies, was that you didn't need to leave the infection, the Listeria, untreated for a long time to generate the immune response. The human immune system actually recognizes Listeria very rapidly and generates a very strong response in a short period of time. And what we identified is that we could actually give the antibiotic on the same day of treatment within 4 hours and have the immune response against the Listeria continue on unabated, as if the infection was still there for a longer period of time. So Advaxis left the infection in for 72 hours, whereas we only leave the infection in for 4 hours. As a result of that reduction, significant reduction in time that the body's infected, there's a lot less risk associated with ongoing continued infection, as well as the risk that the patient just doesn't come back to the hospital after they've received the treatment, which was the biggest risk. And so by virtue of, treating at 4 hours post administration with antibiotics, as opposed to waiting 72 hours, we massively reduce the risk associated with a chronic Listeria infection. And that's one of the big reasons why the FDA allowed us to move forward. So that's really the difference between our approach and what Advaxis was doing, and why we think we can get to the market now, whereas Advaxis couldn't a few years ago.
Hey, Gerald, there's a question from the audience.
Sure, sorry.
How did a company the size of OS Therapies manage to acquire the research of such a high potential platform as Listeria? Hasn't the Listeria platform been exhaustively researched for various cancer treatments? Why does OS Therapies believe it can get FDA approval when other big pharmas have not done so?
Right, and
great question.
Yeah, great question, and I think we kind of answered it, but let me summarize.
Well, the first thing I would say is the platform has not been exhaustively researched. I think just finding out that we could have the same immune response in 4 hours that they thought they could get in 72 hours is a huge difference. I think technologies and the way we got this, because I was there back in 2019, all technologies, whether it's biotech or tech, they're ahead of their time. And cancer vaccines or immunotherapies were really, really hot 10, 12, 14 years ago, 15 years ago. They really started to come into fashion again, the ASCO, after we signed this contract to in-license this technology. The idea of firing up your own immune system within your body was way ahead of its time.
Yeah, I would say that. I would say Paul had because of his close relationship with osteosarcoma, he had a family connection, not someone in his family, but someone close to his family that got it. And as a result of that, went on a mission to find new treatments for this. That is really what drove Advaxis to give him the rights to move that specific indication forward. As Advaxis got into trouble financially, they were trying to do some very large trials and some large indications. As the standard of care in those indications was shifting, which made bringing that to market challenging, they ran into financial difficulties. And so he had, the osteosarcoma. It was kind of a rare pediatric, as they stopped developing this OST HER2 and these other large indications, they gave him the rights to do so through a license that OS paid for through the money it raised pre-IPO, and that's how OS incrementally got access to the platform. So that's how it happened. $250 million was spent by Advaxis. We ended up buying it for less than 20 total. And as Paul pointed out, it was not really exhaustively researched. It was researched not necessarily with this OST HER2 vector as the priority, and also not necessarily in indications where there was a clear unmet medical need with no alternatives. Where there's been a shifting landscape of cancer. You've had antibodies come on the market, antibody drug conjugates come on the market, different PD-1s come on the market. And so, there's been a shift in the standard of care, especially in these larger cancer indications. And when that happens, if you're in the middle of a trial against X and all of a sudden the standard of care changed, you got to go back and do another trial against X plus whatever the new standard of care is. And that can be very expensive. And I'm sure as investors in biotech, you've seen that happen in the past, and it can be very frustrating. The fact that they went after osteosarcoma, where there is really nothing else in development, kind of shielded the OS therapies from that. And it's one of the reasons why getting on the market with that and then doing a label expansion makes a lot more sense than trying to go after one of the larger indications first. So as mentioned before, 1,000 cases per year in osteosarcoma, 20,000 globally. Most of it happens in 15 to 20-year-olds. There's been no new treatments in over 40 years. Approximately 50% of patients have metastases. If you get a metastasis to the lung, you eventually primarily pass away from asphyxiation associated with lung tissue damage. Time to mortality is very low, 12 months, which is one of the reasons why a 12-month no recurrence endpoint was important to the FDA. And the only treatment that's shown any efficacy is to cut out the metastasis to the lung. And so, to be able to prevent the recurrence from a clinical perspective is the most important thing for clinicians treating these patients. So we'll talk now a little bit about the data, just a little bit about the enrollment criteria. 12 to 39-year-olds, they must have had at least one recurrence so that they are recurred and resected metastatic. So we know they're metastatic. It's fully resected. They enter the trial disease-free, and we try to keep them disease-free for 12 months. 41 patients were enrolled. They went from 17 years old to 18 years old, and then they withdrew their consent. So there were only 39 evaluable patients out of the 41 at 21 centers. It was single-arm treatment, full treatment arm. Everyone has completed all doses that went through the study. You finished the study either if you had a recurrence or you completed 52 weeks. The 52-week study was 16 doses every 3 weeks with a 4-week follow-up. Primary endpoint was 12-month event-free survival, with event being a recurrence of metastasis. And the comparator, which is where we're starting to do some work. The original comparator in the study was, let's call it the leading publication from the Children's Oncology Group as it related to the likelihood that a patient would go 12 months without recurring. And I say the leading publication, this data in this very small indication is not very well documented. But these 42 patients that were the comparator were in therapeutic clinical trials of other drugs that failed either because they didn't have enough efficacy or they had toxicity. And so they weren't, able to be moved forward from a therapeutic perspective.
That's good. That's top line.
Yeah. So we do want to say the feedback that we got from FDA, we sent a breakthrough therapy designation request. was that they recommended that instead of using the Children's Oncology Group publication data, we use case match controls. We're in the process of gathering this exact data that FDA has asked for, but it's been challenging identifying it, but we're making progress. Okay, so in terms of the primary efficacy endpoint, we got 33% responders that went 12 months without an event as compared to 20% in the COG publication. This was statistically significant in favor of OST-HER2. So this is the base of everything we're coming from. And as noted, that 20% we really think is high, both in terms of what we've seen in the literature of other studies, of just natural history, as well as in speaking to KOLs. A third of their patients definitely, in their opinion, a much greater percentage, a much lower percentage than a third, go 12 months without recurring. So,
and very important to mention here, very minimal side effects. So chills, slight fever, which for these kids is a walk in the park considering the 9 months of chemo and radiation they've had. But if you think about the importance of minimal side effects to the FDA, certainly around orphan and accelerated approvals, first do no harm. We've definitely checked that box. Again, chills, slight fever. And then there's clearly a response here. And clinical trials are interesting. You don't always get the numbers that you would think. Keytruda, for example, was approved with under 50% response rate. So we think there's into the data, there's subsets that have done even better in this trial.
Right, exactly. And some of those subgroup analyses include female versus male. We know that in general, females do better in osteosarcoma than males. It looks like OST-HER2 may have boosted that performance. So we got a 47% response rate in females versus 20% response rate in males. That was almost statistically significant in terms of a difference, but both treatment groups appear to do better than the natural history. In terms of recurrence, because it's a progressive disease, and so if you get one metastasis, you're highly likely to get another metastasis, which is the whole point of the study. It looks like people who had multiple metastases, whose immune system were exposed to metastases at a higher rate, did better, which in our view is likely because of immune training, which is exactly how our mechanism of action works. We weren't expecting this because typically the more metastases you've had, the poorer the outcome. In our case, the more metastases you've had, the better the outcome. And of course, you don't get the two plus resections without having one resection first. And so from a practical standpoint, clinicians are very pleased with this, because what this says is, hey, even if it doesn't work the first time, it really could work the second time. And who knows, if that 45% of 2+ who failed, potentially they could respond if you give it to them the third time. And again, some of the work that we're seeing from the canines really gives us an inkling into how this we could improve how we do these studies and look at the data with the therapy. In terms of, we did take the FDA's advice with regards to identifying non-concurrent control arm or case match patients, synthetic control. We got the only database available in the United States that was held by a patient group. There were about 56 patients there. We had to whittle it down for the enrollment criteria in our study, which is very limited. You had to have had fully resected, had a recurrence, had that fully resected, be disease-free, and then you had to have all the necessary data time points to be able to actually measure the data. So, there were, a lot of whittling down. We ended up from 56 down to 9 patients. But those 9 patients seem to be pretty representative of the subset that we were looking at if you speak to the KOLs. There, we saw 33% of event-free survival in our treatment, in our group, versus 11% in the natural history database. And interestingly, time to event. So, even if you didn't hit 12 months, did we delay how long it took you to get a recurrence? It looked like yes. We had 5.9 months versus 4.7. So that's great when you look at the 12-month event-free survival, which is the primary endpoint. The secondary endpoint of overall survival, we feel pretty comfortable. When you look at that comparator, we had 12-month overall survival, 91%, 18 months, 80%, 24 months, 61%. In the exploratory of our treatment group versus the natural history database, which is the closest proxy to what the FDA is asking for, we were 91% versus 80% at 12 months and 61% versus 40% at 24 months. So all very much trending in the right direction. And this is really what's giving us confidence that we're, going down the right path. So the next step for us, obviously, is to complete this natural history database, get alignment with the FDA on exactly how to do that. And that we're in the process of getting that alignment now before we, actually finalize that data review and then request the meeting. Obviously, the U.S. is not the only jurisdiction that would be interested in a novel therapy for osteosarcoma. So we are, opening lines of communication over in Europe and some other jurisdictions. So we're taking this forward as quickly as we can, but also making sure that we don't make any mistakes as we move through the process.
So, Gerald, there's another question earlier that we'll come back to, but another question just came in that would be appropriate for this segment here. And the question is, if the control arm comes out stronger than expected, can you potentially get it approved in females only, since that is where the strongest efficacy signal was?
The answer is yeah. Those are the conversations we're going to have with the FDA. Our view is that we don't need to get a broad label. We're going to go for, the broadest label that will get us on market. So if that is female only, then that's where we would go. If this is the recurrence of metastasis, so people who've had 2+ metastasis as opposed to just the first metastasis, that's the label that we're going to go for. For us, from an investment standpoint, as an investor, the most important thing is that we get on market and we get that priority review voucher. That's our priority, and that would allow us to be true to the mission of bringing the first new therapy for osteosarcoma to market here. So that's our focus. Obviously, whatever the limitation of the label is that we start with, we think this mechanism will ultimately be used to treat all osteosarcoma patients.
And other solid tumor questions, which leads beautifully into the next question, which says, OSTX has indicated a desire to pursue the HER2 breast cancer designation after OS approval. The competition in the space is steep with Herceptin and HER2. What is your specific niche in this field? Also, would this be a monotherapy or in combination with existing agents mentioned?
Well, that's obviously a very significant question, and the answer is we haven't finalized exactly where we would go. Obviously, you don't want to go to an area with very high response rates because this is immunotherapy. It's not going to be the cheapest thing in the world, and you're going to end up going to refractory disease in certain areas, as well as areas with high recurrence that are not well controlled. Right now, where exactly we go within, let's call it those fields, we haven't spent the time and resources to really figure that out. But we do know, if you've got a 99% survival rate, we're probably not going to go there. We're going to go to areas where there are much more challenges.
But there is no 99% response rate in solid tumors, and specifically to the question, it would be in combination with standard of care. We know that Herceptin and HER2, it's eventually the cancer blows through that and the cancer builds resistance. The beauty of our therapy is that we're coming in underneath the Herceptin or trastuzumab, and it seems that the immunotherapy is killing the cancer, which would make Herceptin or HER2 work better, and we would suspect better results in breast cancer. Another question came up, Gerald, which I think is really on point. The FDA seems very focused these days on the survival rate more than the response rate. Who established the 12-month survival parameter for the comparison? Is the FDA agreeable to that parameter? I would say emphatically to that question that the FDA is agreeable to that parameter because they were the one that suggested it to us. We do believe that event-free survival, which is not a typical endpoint for an oncology trial, but if you think about our patients, they've had the cancer resected from their chest, from their lungs. So they're technically not, they're technically cancer-free. But since they've had a metastasis, we know they're going to have another one within a year, at least a 87 to 91% chance that they're going to have another metastasis in a year. So they are cancer-free when they start the trial, and that's why the FDA suggested event-free survival. I do think that with our event-free survival data so far, we're a very good candidate for accelerated or conditional approval. And then get on the market. They may have some post-market analysis they want us to do, but we could also get into that phase 3, either bundle or breast cancer trial. And then we could also get the full approval once the 3-year overall survival comes in.
Yeah, and that's really important to note. This is the prevention of recurrence. This is not treatment, extending life. Obviously, if we prevent recurrence, you're going to extend life. But that's, in this indication where you have consistent ongoing metastases to the lung, if you prevent metastases to the lung, you prevent death, right? And that's the objective. And again, this study, when it was started, I don't think it was anticipated to be a registrational trial. But as a result of the data, and the data being very consistent with the canine data and the mechanism, and there were some tweaks. If we could do this again today, where if a patient recurred, we would put them back on therapy, whereas in the existing study, we didn't do that. There's a lot of potential to alter the curve. So it's one of the reasons, and especially with the side effect profile, it's one of the reasons we think that this type of approach warrants getting on market sooner, giving the clinicians the ability to treat patients and tracking that data and how the best practices lead to the best outcomes. And we think that the KOLs ultimately will agree with that. The patient advocates will agree with that. And obviously the patients, will have a better chance with this therapy versus without it. Speaking of those KOLs, we've got just a great group of clinicians that we've been collaborating with on this, and strong patient advocacy advisory board. It's important to note every single one of these entities invested in OST-HER2 in some form or fashion. We've had really good exposure, even though OS Therapies wasn't mentioned. Dr. Nicola Mason and Yvonne Patterson were featured in a 60 Minutes piece by Anderson Cooper that really shows the potential of the technology. And we're going to be moving forward with both the KOLs and the patient advocates as we engage, hope to engage with FDA towards an approval. Separately, we've got a strong antibody drug conjugate advisory board, especially Dr. Boris Shore, who's an ex-Pfizer. He used to work on ADCs at Pfizer, very much understands them, and he's helping us with our strategy on the ADC technology. And then we've got a strong commercialization board to help us think through and start to execute in preparation for commercial launch, both in canines and in humans. And it's important to also note, we've partnered up with J&J as a J Labs company. So they've, kind of taken a look under the hood at our technology, especially our ADC technology, and they're keeping close tabs on us.
We're starting to run out of time, Gerald, but I
Yeah.
did want to answer this question. What is the likelihood that the PRV program gets reauthorized given the priorities of the current administration? And assuming you achieve approval, what would be the 150 million in non-diluted funds be utilized for? I actually think that the PRV, look, I'm often wrong. I'm married, but I do think the priority review voucher will be reauthorized either in March of this year or in August of this year. Sorry, July of this year. It's a program that, regardless of where you stand politically, it doesn't cost the government any money, and it's getting new treatments to rare and pediatric diseases. What would we use the 150 million? And I'm not sure if it's going to be 150 million if it gets reauthorized. It may drop down to 100. It may not, because the demand for these PRVs is very high. What we would use it for is commercialization of the human osteosarcoma, potential commercialization of the canine osteosarcoma, and then pivoting to the other solid tumors. And then the fourth priority is our ADC, antibody drug conjugate business, for which we just created a sub company and are moving our assets into that, which we did a press release a couple weeks ago. So.
Yeah. So on that note, we do have a team that has some experience in commercializing products. Paul, did this at Amgen, at J&J, and Boehringer Ingelheim. So he's got experience in terms of putting the pieces together to actually launch product. So that does give us a leg up on the typical, hey, I've got a great asset and it does cool stuff, but I don't know how to get into the market. Paul actually knows how to do that. So in summary, we've got multiple near-term catalysts. We've got data, we've got regulatory interactions, regulatory meetings, and then looking for approval. These are in areas of significant unmet medical need where we can get a significant market share initially in the osteosarcoma indication, then expand. We also think we can create some real value out of the ADC platform by leveraging our public company position and then rewarding shareholders as a result of that. We think, osteosarcoma, there's been nothing for a long time. The outcomes are very poor. Our therapy appears to be pretty safe. And certainly we think the efficacy warrants getting this into the hands of clinicians and, early, so that patients can get the benefit, and then we can quantify that benefit on a larger scale in the market, given the small number of patients. And we've got a leadership team that's been able to execute both in the getting the products through trials as well as bringing them to market, which ultimately is going to be where the value is. And that's the story of OS Therapies. I don't know if there are any other questions.
I didn't see. Is OS Therapies currently talking to potential partners in anticipation of FDA approval? Yes. The consistent message that we've received from potential partners, both in commercialization in the US and ex-US for human osteosarcoma, is they want to see, first of all, the comparative data that we are putting together right now. And then that should be enough to at least restart conversations in that space. And then feedback from the FDA on our approach and their suggestion on our approach is something that's very important to our potential partners as well.
Yeah. And I'll note, of course, as we get that data and as we get the FDA feedback and the likelihood of approval goes up, the value also goes up, and the value to us goes up. And so the value of a partnership has to be worth it. It's, there's no point in just partnering for the wrong deal, which is one of the reasons why we did the Ayala Advaxis transaction, really position us to do the right deal, because we can commercialize this ourselves. There are 30 centers in the US that, treat these patients. 21 of them were in our trial. The PIs in our trial are the people that would buy and recommend the product. So, we don't need some PBM in the middle to make this happen. we can do this ourselves. And we've been researching options to actually commercialize ex-US through different partnerships that would keep us with the rights to the product, more in a revenue model. And there are a lot of options available.
So Gerald, I'm going to put these last two questions together. You mentioned at the start that you were intending to comment on the recent price action. Why is the share price so down with all this excitement?
So in my the stock gods know, I don't know what I think. One, there was lockup expired. So we had early investors who had a low cost basis, many of whom got out when there was a significant amount of trading volume in the stock. And the chart kind of broke, let's call it. So, when you look at it on a technical basis, it didn't look great for a new entrance. Certainly the backdrop of biotech in general is not great right now. There's a lot of uncertainty just from the larger players, what kind of partnerships there are going to be. People thought rates were going to get cut a lot more than they've been cut. And so risk capital isn't quite there right now. People are awaiting the next phase in our regulatory process. And maybe that's the trigger that some people are waiting on to get into the stock. I think there's a confluence of factors as it relates to just supply and demand and catalyst-driven demand. But in general, the selling from, the early guys is gone. So that's done. We're making progress to get the right information into the hands of the FDA and have a productive conversation. We're aligning, ex-US conversations, and we're getting our KOLs and, advisors aligned. So, we're doing all the things that we have to do. Luckily, we have enough cash, so we don't need to dilute the stock. And so the pressure on us to, move as fast as possible and maybe make mistakes isn't there. We want to move fast, but we want to make sure that we are judicious and we don't make any mistakes because we feel like we've got a pretty nice setup. So,
and I don't think this is forward leaning or anything. The company is no different from when it was $7 than what it is now. I think right now it's just a really good deal.
Yeah, it is. It is what it is. We think sometimes the market throws the baby out with the bathwater, and that's okay because we don't have to dilute. So we're just going to execute, and we think at some point the market will respond.
In the end, biotech lives and dies on data. We've already shared our data. Our initial data looks really good.
Gentlemen, I'm not seeing any more questions in the queue, nor am I seeing any raised hands. Shall we wrap up now?
Sure. I'll leave Paul to give the closing message.
Well, one, I'd like to thank Gerald for pinch hitting for me because I don't know what of the 4 viruses out there right now I have, and I've been bedridden for the last day and a half, and I've probably got another day and a half left. I will say thank you very much to all of you that tuned in. We've been really happy with our partnership with RedChip, and it's great to have Gerald on the team. We have an excellent team that is focused on executing and getting this product approved for kids that have osteosarcoma. The cool thing is, if it works in osteosarcoma, which was considered one of the toughest cancers out there, then we can pivot to all these other solid tumors. A lot of them not doing well. I mean, breast cancer, the survival rates are higher, but there's still 40,000 people a year dying of breast cancer in the United States, and we think we can help with that. But esophageal cancer, colorectal cancer, some of these other tough to treat cancers, we think we have a chance with our therapy. And it's not a bad business thesis or investment thesis to go where everyone else isn't. And back to the question about Listeria, I don't think this platform got its day in the sun, and we think that the ability to extend life and to prevent metastasis with this is a great opportunity. And then our other technology, the ADC technology, is really, really cool. We didn't get to it, but what we're doing is we're covering our payloads with silicone. And the beauty of silicone is it gets eaten up by pH, not by proteins or water. So all those payloads going around through the body are protected until they get into the cancer environment. And since that's a lower pH, higher acidity, it eats away at the casing and eats away at the linker and drops the payload right where we want it. So we think that could significantly improve chemotherapy and monoclonal antibodies and mRNAs by not getting degraded as it goes through the body and causing side effects that are unwanted. So thank you for supporting our mission. Again, I think the stock's an incredible deal right now.
No, thank you very much, gentlemen. Yes, this webinar will be available on your website as well as on ostxinfo.com. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.